This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon. My name is Helen Collis. I'm a healthcare journalist for Politico Europe, and you're watching Politico Live, the live extension of our journalism. I'm coming to you from here in Brussels, and today we're going to be addressing what is now a very pressing issue in Europe: how to ensure the continued access to generic and biosimilar medicines, which make up the vast majority of the drugs prescribed across the region. Today, producers are facing unprecedented market challenges, from double-digit inflation at the highest levels seen for decades, soaring energy costs, and freight and shipping rates surging. Hospital budgets are also squeezed by this inflation, but for now, many of these medicines are locked into long-term procurement contracts. With some of the lowest profit margins of all medicines, however, these two sectors, generic drugs and biosimilars, are at particular risk of becoming loss-making, especially those drugs that are energy-intensive to make, such as sterile solutions. Meanwhile, it's these off-patent therapies that allow widespread access to medicines for patients across the bloc. Today's market challenges, however, may threaten that access more so than ever. We will be discussing this and more with our panelists, but first we have some housekeeping. I would like to thank our sponsor, Viatris, for making this event possible, and thank our audience for joining us online. We would like to make this event as interactive as possible. You can participate by tweeting about it at @LivePolitico and ask questions through Slido using the hashtag #ProtectingMedicines. You know who we are, so I will be prioritising questions that are sent with a name and organisation. You can already share your thoughts and answer the following poll presented by Viatris. So, when it comes to protecting patients' access to affordable medicines, should off-patent medicines sector be prioritised in EU national emergency plans, and how could EU or national policies be adjusted to deal with such high cost of inflation? We will look at the results at the end of our panel. So, before we get started, we'll now hear some opening remarks from our partner, Victor Lino Mendonça, Head of Corporate Affairs Europe at Viatris. Victor.
Thank you very much, and welcome all to this webinar, Protecting Patient Access to Affordable Medicines as Inflation Bites. Viatris is proud to sponsor this discussion as we aim to identify the policy measures that will help to protect patient access to medicines, to off-patent medicines, and continue to deliver on its mission during these unprecedented and challenging times. We should keep in mind that the off-patent industry supplies 70% of the medicines in Europe, making patient access to affordable medicines a key aspect of its mission. Before handing over to the panel discussion, I just would like to mention a few aspects that should be considered in the definition of policies that aim to secure patient access to medicines. Initially, like already mentioned, the European economy is under a lot of strain, right? Inflation above 10%. The manufacturing price index has rose by 40%. Shipping rates are 6 times more expensive for air freights. Energy costs have increased by 230% from last year. And even absenteeism due to the COVID hygiene measures has increased, have an impact on the production capacity. Raw materials like aluminium foil, which is essential for the production of blisters for medicines, or even water to cool down machinery in the production process, is scarce and expensive. These trends impact all the industries in Europe, or most industries in Europe. And all of us feel it every time that we go to the supermarket or every time that we go to the petrol station. However, the challenge for the pharmaceutical industry is quite unique, as the current pricing systems in Europe do not allow any price adjustments, even to cope with the inflation or additional costs of business. Actually, what we see across Europe is very aggressive restrictive measures, healthcare budgets being cut, and policy measures that aim to further cut down prices. We all know that if a business is facing exponentially cost increases and it's not able to reflect those costs in the final price, that very quickly many of the products will become economically unviable. And this has an impact on patient access to medicines, the reason why this industry exists, and the reason that should drive us all. And every day we see it on the media, right? In many markets across Europe, like Belgium, 1 in 5 products that were on the market are no longer available. Or Romania, where over 2,000 medicines have disappeared from the market and many more are at risk. We need to find solutions. We need to work together to find those solutions to allow the off-patent industry to continue to deliver on its mission about access. One potential solution could be the inclusion of an inflation index that would allow the prices to be adjusted to reflect the inflation and the additional cost of goods. In conclusion, the off-patent industry supplies 70% of medicines in Europe, only accounting for 30% of this spending. This makes generic medicines a key tool for governments and payers across Europe to deliver on patient access and to manage the healthcare budgets. We need to make sure that we protect this mission. We need to act together to contribute to protect patient access to affordable medicines. I would like to thank all the speakers for joining these discussions, hopefully to help to drive this dialogue in Europe and find those policy solutions that will deliver on patient access. Thank you all. Thank you for joining, and I hand over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. I think that sets the scene very clearly for our panel discussion today. Joining me today virtually, we have Jakub Dvoracek, Deputy Health Minister of the Czech Republic. Welcome, Jakub. Marco Greco, President of the European Patients Forum. Welcome, Marco.
Thank you.
Tilly Metz, MEP for the Greens and EFA from Luxembourg, and also member of the European Parliament's Health and Environment Committee, ENVI. Welcome, Tilly. And Adrian van den Hoven, Director General of Medicines for Europe, which represents the generics and biosimilars sectors. Welcome, Adrian. So as Victor has set out, companies tell us they are facing a series of pressures throughout the supply chain for generics and biosimilars. Raw materials, manufacturing and freight costs are all soaring, but procurement contracts are tied in and allow little wiggle room for these two prices to change. He says that's resulting in some countries seeing products withdrawn and delayed. Tilly, I'd like to come to you first as our MEP in the room. What's your view on this situation? Are you hearing of products being withdrawn? And do you think it's right that they are withdrawn if they are no longer profitable?
I mean, what we see right now in this pandemic is really that something needs to change, that the system which is now, like it is now, is not working. So we have to rethink in order to prevent shortages, in order also to prevent that the industry at one moment says we have to withdraw medication because for us it's not economically possible anymore. So I think it's really the sign that we have now that we have to rethink the system of monitoring shortages, of working together with the different stakeholders, of course, with the on one side with the industry, with the pharma companies, but also with the consumers, with the healthcare workers. And I think we should be better in coordinating, cooperating in this sense, and also preventing those shortages. Yes.
Thank you, Tilly. Adrian, I would like to come to you next. Can you shed some light on the scale of these added cost burdens for the sector? What impact is it having on companies' bottom line? For example, what proportion does the cost of energy account for in manufacturing a common generic, for example?
Well, thanks a lot for this. So I think the impacts are obviously significant. When we came out of the pandemic, there was a big logistical and inflationary challenge. Unfortunately, when Russia invaded Ukraine, then the situation became even more dire with the explosion of the cost of energy and logistics, et cetera. And now what's happening is that for most generic companies, which are about 70% of the prescription medicine supply, they're dealing with energy costs like electricity costs that in some cases have tripled, so increased by 3 times. They're dealing with higher raw material costs, whether it's chemical ingredients or whether it's, say, packaging materials and things like that. And they're dealing with logistics, so transport costs that have gone up between 300 and 500%. And all of this on medicines that are very, very inexpensive for the society. In some ways, that's great because we've doubled the access to medicines by using generic medicines in Europe, so that's fantastic. But in this inflationary environment, it's very, very difficult to continue to supply. On the energy cost issue, how it impacts, it really depends on the type of production. So for a lot of hospital products that are injected into people or through an IV, for example, those medicines have to be sterile. So that means they have to be heated and cooled a second time. And so that requires a huge amount of energy. Similarly, types of production like antibiotics, you need to do fermentation. That requires a lot of electricity to be able to do that. So for some of these medicines, which are probably the cheapest medicines in Europe, the energy cost is a really big factor. And I fear that for many of the products, they will just become unviable in the very short term, like in the next 6 months, let's say.
Thank you, Adrian. Let's turn to the patient sector next. Marco, as our patient representative here, can you set out for us what impact this is having on patients, if at all, at the moment? Are shortages increasing? And if so, if one is withdrawn, is it easy to find an alternative?
Thanks for the question. It's a difficult situation, it's a delicate one for several reasons. The first one is that we are coming from a period that was already challenging per se. The COVID pandemic has created a lot of troubles in access healthcare system in general for obvious reasons, no? And that has come as a result, has taken, for example, delay in diagnosis, delay in getting in touch with your doctor, in changing therapies, in accessing even to therapies. So this was already a problem. We thought we would have come out of these after the pandemic and also with some lessons learned. It's not happening due also to what has happened in Ukraine and the general economic crisis. This is a big issue because, generics and biosimilars have been a fantastic chance to increase accessibility in the wider sense. So I'm thinking particularly, Adrian has presented the statistics before, but we need to take it to real life. And in many countries, particularly in Eastern countries, biosimilars are indeed very often the only possibility that patients may have to access that kind of therapies that are very often top-end therapies or very delicate therapies or life-saving therapies. So we are particularly worried about these. We are experiencing through our members already some of these shortages issues because they have been reported. I'm not sure that the actual extension of mandate to the European Medicine Agency to cover the shortages subject is at the moment, as it is designed, capable also to intercept this situation. But as a matter of fact, the overall result is, in my opinion, that there is a concrete risk that we will go 10 years back when it comes to accessibility if we don't find a solution, if we don't stop the cascade effect that is starting, that is already on the go. And so this may result in an enormous extra and unprevented cost for the healthcare system that is already been put under stress by the COVID emergency. Because if you put together the fact that we didn't make enough prevention exams before, and now we have the problem of people that will be cut out of therapies, the long-term, the mid-term, not long-term effect for patients and the stress on the healthcare system will be dramatic.
Mm. Thank you, Marco. Some really concerning points raised there. Jakob, I'd like to turn to you next. First of all, if you can put your Health Ministry hat on for the giving us the inside view on the scale of this issue from the Czech Republic. Is the Czech Republic seeing any supply issues currently with generics and biosimilars? And is it something your country is anticipating as the colder weather sets in and energy prices are more of a concern?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. If I take it, the current situation here, and I believe it's reflecting also in the other member states. Of course, we see the more interruption in supplies as the other countries. We try to really, do some analytic work and to see, how it is different, with the previous years. And yes, there is more interruptions. On other hand, it's not really reflecting what we expected. What will happen. So yes, we see that the market is changing, but compared to maybe some other member states, we are not doing the big tenders in the Czech Republic. So we have a number of suppliers. It's not that we are closing the market, for one or two suppliers. It's based on the tenders of hospitals, and I believe, this is protecting a bit, the market, the Czech market itself, and also the market of the countries, where they have the big tenders, which then have a one winner or two winners, which then can share the whole market. And then if something happened, of course, they are heavily affected. So it's based, on how the member states, approaching the tendering, in the area of generics. And we also have to think, about the two different fields, the generic and the biosimilars. Is the price of biosimilars also the big issues as the generics on the market? I'm talking about the small molecules and the way of production and the price of the small molecules, those very old generics. Where it's 100% true that the price is really low, and any, let's say, increase of cost, doesn't matter if it's energy or transportation, can make a level of instability, in the system. So I think, we have to really, differentiate between, what we can do it on the European level and what could be done on the national level to protect the supplies. And this is the way, how the question should be probably placed it. And yes, if you run the whole country tenders, then you are really coming to the big risk. And on the other hand, you see that the companies, marketing authorization holders, they are coming with a price, to those tenders. And then it's very difficult, for those, who are responsible for tendering, not to choose the provider, the supplier who has the lowest price. Of course, we can start to think, how to also reflect, to the tenders, the way of production, how the supply chain is robust, from where the API is coming, and so on. But it will be probably quite difficult, and it's on the individual member state, how they approach the situation.
Thank you, Jakob. Bringing up some of the points you raised about tendering and procurement and how they differ across each EU country and how this might be affecting what choice that hospitals have in prescribing for their patients. Tilly, what's your view on procurement of medicines for these types of products, the sort of biosimilars and generics? Do you think is there a best procurement model to allow both equitable access to these products, but at the same time ensure that the markets remain viable for the producers?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think also here regarding biosimilars and generics, we have to think also of joint procurement that we can do. As I said also before, the coordination between industry and the member states is very important. And let me say that in general, I make a little bit a loophole now. In general, the health sector, I think we need there a paradigm shift. So really to guarantee that health care, access to treatment, access to medicine is a right, and that patient everywhere it should be accessible, affordable in every member state. And therefore, we have to differentiate what we can do at the short term. And there, of course, I'm thinking now regarding generics and biosimilars of state aid. I'm thinking of, as I said, of joint procurement. I'm thinking of better anticipating, monitoring. But at the long term, I think it would be very important to have a European medicine infrastructure. So really where there is done research and development, where there is done manufacturing, where there is done also with delivery capacities, because we have to do this paradigm shift. The only economic logic does not work when it comes to health issues. So that's why I think we have to be stronger there as an EU, looking at the USA, where we have that already. So also geopolitically, it would be important that we be stronger there and also open the door also for more public-private partnerships. So I think it's not against the pharma industry. It's just that we should, as public authorities, play a stronger role in guaranteeing this affordable and accessible medicines and treatments for everybody.
Thank you, Tilly. Some really interesting points there. Jakob, you are our representative here today who can represent Europe, if you like, as the Czech Republic has the presidency currently. So with that hat on, Tilly mentioned that access to medicines should be a human right. And we've seen Europe step up and jointly procure numerous vaccines and medicines in the pandemic and more recently for monkeypox. Are there any discussions at the EU level to expand this to things like generics and biosimilars across Europe?
To be honest, unfortunately, and sorry, Tilly, I have to a bit disagree, on this idea of joint procurement for generics and biosimilars, because what we need, in this area is, let's say, as many suppliers as possible, and we can see that the markets which do not tender, like one or two suppliers, have much, let's say, better resilience against the interruption of supplies. Because if you allow to have the number of companies, number of marketing authorization holders who produce the same molecule, same or similar product, then you have a market which is much more resilient against the negative impacts. On the other hand, if you do the joint procurement and then you have one big supplier for a huge market, then you are in a very big risk that in a certain moment when this supplier has problems with production or with the supplies of API, you can have a big difficulties, to really have somebody else to replace it, the supplies to the market, to quickly, restore the supplies and so on. So I am very supportive to have the joint procurement and discussion to extend the joint procurement in the area of, for example, of rare disease or the unique molecules which are under the patent protection. because it doesn't make a sense to have a big tender. You have usually a very few suppliers. But in the area of generics, you have to keep as many companies, as many marketing authorization holders as possible. Of course, and it's true what Kelly said, reflect from where they took the API, how robust is their supply chain, and how they are able to in the past also to see how they were able to fulfill their supplies to the states where they get the requests. So definitely to have a different kind of tendering, to include to the tenders those criteria which will support the producers and marketing authorization holders who have a robust production and supply chain, but really to have the variety of suppliers, to have the market protected for the difficulties of one or two companies.
Tilly, you were shaking your head there, and I just want to give you a chance to respond, and then I want to come to Adrian as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. But we saw now in the vaccine strategy that we had at the European level that it is not because we did advanced purchase agreement and now a procurement that we work only with one company. So the one does not exclude the other. So we can perfectly well also with joint procurement, we have to work with different companies, of course. But I think the power to negotiate, of course, is much stronger if we do it on the level of joint procurement. And we could also do that in such crucial, important areas than biosimilar and generics. And just if I may add just one sentence, I spoke before that in the short term, now we have to think about state aid, because now allowing the biosimilars and the generics companies that produce them to not to reduce their energy consumption. I think that is not the solution, but to give them state aid. Yes, but in order to give them public money, we need, of course, complete transparency on where does the money goes to and how much of the energy price indeed is impacting the price of the production, etc. So there we need then also to put all the cards on the table. That is something I wanted to add also. Thank you.
Thank you, Tilly. Adrian, I wanted to get your response to the joint procurement debate. Where do you sit on that idea? But also the point that Tilly raised about the public authorities playing a stronger role in R&D and producing products that are essential for European citizens. On those two issues, where does the industry stand?
Yeah, so I think on the joint procurement, I'm going to actually agree with Jakob and disagree with Tilly for different reasons. I think we had experience with joint procurement for generic medicines during COVID-19 for ICU emergency medicines. We actually proposed that member states prepare for the second wave, and a joint procurement was launched for that purpose. Really, the difficulty was it was almost impossible for either the manufacturers or the buyers, the member states, to understand how to do this. And this is for a lot of technical reasons, in big part because many of these products don't have European licenses. They have these national licenses. And so doing this kind of joint procurement with generics is excruciatingly difficult. And in fact, for that joint procurement, almost no medicines were actually sold. So in fact, what happened, most member states afterwards returned to a national procurement. So it was quite a disaster from a practical point of view. And we also saw recently, HERA was considering a joint procurement for potassium iodine because of the risk of a nuclear accident or incident. And there they very quickly decided not to do it that way, but rather to go through the civil protection agencies of the medicines agencies, again, for this same very practical reason that to license across Europe, you don't have this license across Europe. So it's excruciatingly painful, I would say, for buyers and sellers to do it in a joint procurement. But what I do agree with Tilly, though, is coming back to her first point, we have a system in Europe right now where if for economic reasons your product is unviable, you're going to withdraw the product, there's no real possibility to negotiate to prevent that as Tilly was rightly pointing out, she's absolutely correct on that. And that's a loophole in our system. You know, we should be able to discuss with the authorities to say, okay, can we arrange this so that there's no withdrawal, so that there's no shortage or lack of availability for the patients? This would be better for the governments, and it would be better for the industry. And most importantly, it would be better for the patient's supply. But we don't have that mechanism now. And actually, we've specifically on the inflation point, we've raised this with the Commission. They're very cautious because they say this is not our business. This is the member states' business. But they recognize the problem, and maybe there's an opportunity to have just a discussion between the industry and the member states on this to respect the sensitivities around healthcare competence, to say, okay, is there something we could think of that would be like a mechanism that each one could introduce in their own very different systems? And I think that could be something that could be very, very helpful. I think also coming to joint procurement, where I agree with both Tilly and Jakob, is that having single winner procurement is not a good idea because you rely on one single company. It's better to have multi-winner systems. In Czech they have that. In Denmark they're introducing that, but in some countries they don't play along that line. And here there's something as well the EU can really help. The EU has a procurement law which applies to medicines, and all of these features of meet criteria or multi-winner tenders are in the directive, but a lot of procurers, they struggle to implement those. So I know procuring agencies and I know the industry, we would both like to see Commission guidelines on how to do that, because that would benefit procurers, so the buyers, and it would benefit the industry, the sellers, and it would be really a win-win. And that's something that the EU could do. Again, there are big differences in procurement across countries, so it can't be something very, very rigid, but a guidance to help move things forward in a clear legal framework would be probably beneficial to buyers and sellers, and probably increase the supply and reduce some of these risks going forward. And the last point on Tilly's point about investing in manufacturing resilience, we 100% agree. We need to work together on that. There is a challenge with the interpretation of state aid law when it comes to the off-patent industry, because obviously we're commercial. So that's a difficult point. And I agree on the transparency point. One thing I want to say positive, the Commission is trying here. So they are looking at proposing funding under IPCEI, Important Project of Common European Health, European Interest, for health, where they are looking at possibly supporting certain greener production technologies, which would enable a certain reshoring of activity into Europe, which is something that I think is a great opportunity. Again, the interpretation of the state aid guidelines is going to be very difficult here, as Tilly was rightly pointing out. It's not straightforward to do this, but at least the Commission is reflecting on it. So that's at least a positive point. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Adrian. So Marco, I'd love to get your views on what you think should be done about this. As Adrian mentioned, there's no mechanism to pre-warn any countries or health systems that they are going to have products withdrawn. There's obviously some disagreement around joint procurement. What's your view on what needs to be done to protect access to these types of medicines?
I think we needed to make a quick step back, and it is the premises are we have two premises. The first one is that, and I fully agree on that, accessibility to healthcare and to medicines have to be considered a human right. If we start from these, then we need to accept the fact that we need a rethinking of the strategy. Also because healthcare, as a matter of fact, I'm not talking about what it's written in the EU Constitution, but as a matter of fact, it is not only a national problem. When it comes to healthcare, it is international, it is European by definition, in my opinion, and in the opinion of patients, because we are all European citizens, we are all members of Europe, and so we have the same right of access in all the European countries. That is the second premise. Starting from this, it is a consequence, in our opinion, the fact that we need to rethink the overall strategy in order to better protect European citizens all over the EU. So we are in a phase in which the Commission is rethinking the pharma strategy. We are in a peculiar moment because we have just come out of a very difficult situation. We need not only to learn, but to proactively work on what we have learned till now over the last 2 years and a half. So it's clear in this moment that in a moment of emergency, we need to find a, let's say, even a creative way of help. Call it social bumpers, call it the way you prefer. It is the moment in which we need a strong European intervention. I agree with Adrian when he mentioned the practicality, the problems when you do that in practical. The point is that we have more than 20 different, almost 30 different systems, and it's very difficult to making them dialoguing. It is probably from these that we need to start thinking about how to go over this problem, to find a solution for making these systems better communicating, because as a matter of fact, when we work as Europe, we work better and we have more options and more results. This doesn't mean to undermine in any way the liberalism of our markets and so on. It's simply to have the market working in a better way. As a patient, and as a citizen, I would like this also to be an important chance for starting a reshoring process. That is important. Healthcare, the healthcare market, because it is also a market, it's essential as it is connected to human rights. And I believe it's important that Europe will start working on having the possibility of direct control of, let's say, of avoiding this kind of problems in the future. Taking back the production to Europe can be a first important step, at least in some cases, and there are possibilities in this. So there are different options that are on the table, and but one thing that has not been mentioned, and I'm sorry, but it's my work to say this today. It's also to engage with patients. We are the first one in detecting very often shortages, even before authorities sometimes, because as a matter of fact, we don't find the drug in the pharmacy, we don't find the drug in the hospital. And so very often we are the first one in signaling it. And today we are raising a number of red flags that we want to be seen, and we want to be engaged in the solution process. That's we are happy to be engaged, and we are ready to be engaged.
Thank you, Marco. Jakub, if you can keep your EU Czech presidency cap on for me, please. Last year, due to the pandemic, there was extensive dialogue between the European Commission and medicine stakeholders on how to ensure the security of supply of medicines. And we're expecting a report soon from the Commission, I was told yesterday, that on that dialogue. Do you think more needs to be done to shore up and stabilise the supply and supply chains of medicines in Europe? As Marco just mentioned there, sort of the importance is an important chance, he said, of reshoring processes. What's your view on that?
To be honest, it's an easy question, but very complicated answer. Yeah, the thing is, and it was already mentioned here, we are not talking about the big international, or not only the big international companies, in the production of generics and biosimilars. I just mentioned it already here that the number of those marketing authorization holders are only registered in one country, in few countries. They are not covering the whole European market. So to create the response of a whole Europe, to cover the situation of generic and biosimilars will be probably very complicated. And we can see that the United States and FDA is producing a report on the shortages quite regularly. And I would like to, just to think, about what could be done, what could be the outcomes of discussion here in Europe. And I believe we will come to a quite similar response as it comes, from those recommendations and reports of FDA. To really have a chance to encourage the generic industry to really be more active in the Europe, to produce it more in the Europe, we can only make their life simpler. So to decrease the regulation, to create, the environment which will allow, the simpler production of generics in the Europe, and it's also something what is already happening in the United States. We will have to have the big step, coming from member states to become the part of the production, to be really, a player, which will say, okay, we have some essential pharmaceutics, and we do not see, the commercial sector to cover it in safe way, and we will have to do our own steps to create, the production and to have a more influence, in the production of certain pharmaceutics. So we have two choices. We could go, to let's say the simpler environment and more friendly environment, for commercial subjects, commercial companies in generic market, or to have the direct influence of state. And me personally, I prefer much more to have let's say more friendly environment for companies to do their job, to do their part of a business, and to really think, about the support they need. On the other hand, to incentivize the production, to incentivize the generic industry in Europe, it will mean to incentivize it forever. I mean, if you see, how much of the API is produced in India, in China, out of the Europe, to have it, the secure market, with generics based on those APIs produced outside of the Europe, it will mean that the Europe will have to subsidize and incentivize that probably forever. So we have to really agree, what we can do to make the chance to restart the production of API in Europe, to make the life of those companies easier, and then to ensure, that we have enough production, for our patient. But I think the main issue is with price, and price is set up mainly, by the tendering. So if we really reflect the meet criteria, if we really reflect, where is the pharmaceuticals produced, where and how the API is supplied, and how robust is the supply chain, it could be probably quite enough to have a better price and better reimbursement for those companies producing the generics and biosimilars in Europe. And it's, from my perspective, it's probably the best way to do it, because it could be done on the national state ground. It could be done immediately. We don't have to change the legislation. We don't have to find the extraordinary funds. It's just to reflect what makes the suppliers more stable and to pay a good price, for their supplies.
Thank you, Jakub. I've got a host of really interesting questions coming through on Slido. I would love to pick up on many of the points you raised, but the last one in particular around pricing is one of the top questions we've got on Slido. And Tilly, I'll direct this one to you first, if that's okay. Anonymous is asking, does inflation threaten to blow up the pricing model for generic drugs in the EU? Phrased a different way from how Jakub has just positioned it. And can the model be saved? And if so, how? So we have the reference pricing model for most generics across Europe, which ensures that most countries are paying sort of the lowest average price for their drugs. I think that's what they're alluding to there. Are you concerned that this will change or increase the price of generic drugs in the EU?
Was the question to me, Helen?
It was, Tilly, yes. If procurement and tendering is based more on price, are we going to see more expensive generic medicines effectively?
I mean, the risk, as we said at the very beginning, with the inflation, with the energy prices, the shipping prices, and everything that comes around the production, and also the waste disposal is getting more expensive. Of course, the companies are saying if we cannot have higher prices on indexation of the price, then we cannot produce. That's clearly what they're saying. And then I'm saying, the thoughts that we have now regarding gas, for example, on capping a price, and that the states covers the more cost. But again, as I said, therefore, that is the situation that we have to face right now. But therefore, we need complete transparency on the costs, indeed. So that is the first thing. And then I come back at the long time, sorry to repeat myself, I think it's very important, and relocalization was mentioned of active elements. We all saw during this pandemic our enormous dependency of production outside the EU, which is also related to cost, etc. So I think that it is important that we really, at the long term, have this European medicine infrastructure where we coordinate better research and development, manufacturing, etc. Right now, what we did at the EU level is give a larger mission mandate to the European Medicine Agency and to ECDC in order to prevent shortages and also to be better prepared and to avoid them. So for me, again, there's these two levels. What can we do at short term, and what needs to be done at long term to rethink together with all the stakeholders. And before I spoke about consumers, I meant, of course, the patients that we have, of course, also to implicate, to make participate in this whole discussion.
Adrian, what's your view on that? How urgent is this? Do we need short-term measures to allow price flexibility in these contracts?
Yeah, so I do fear that we actually need to move quickly, especially on the pricing models, as Jakob and everybody has rightly pointed out. In the end, these are member state decisions, but I think it should actually be done in a somewhat, at least, open way between the countries. I think it's relatively straightforward for the industry to point out what the costs are and what impact this has on generic prices, because I mean, in the end, most buyers in the member states, they know the prices. So these are not things that are very secretive, I would say, on the generic side of things. So this is relatively straightforward. So I think this can happen. But it has to happen quickly, because these inflationary impacts are right now, and the decisions to maintain the medicines, which is what we hope, are unfortunately coming very soon. So we want to make sure we anticipate, we prevent supply disruptions rather than we try and solve them kind of later on. What I'd like to point out is we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So these price reference systems, the systems to encourage generic competition, are good systems. They help encourage competition. They bring massive savings to governments. They increase the number of patients who can be treated. I mean, it's really huge. So these are good systems. They just need adjustments to inflation, because they were designed to lower the price of medicines, to always bring the price of medicines down. They were not designed for, you have inflation, energy costs, and things like this. How do you increase the price of a 30-year-old medicine? And this is a small adjustment to the system that we're looking for, and that doesn't need to destroy, I would say, everything. So I think it's really a question of adjustment. The same with procurement. I think the procuring agents, they want to use meet criteria. They want to use multi-winner tenders. Sometimes it's difficult legally at the national level because of the way they implemented the EU procurement directive. With guidance from the Commission, that unlocks that ability for procurers to do exactly what Jakob said they're doing in Czech Republic, and which enables them to have more suppliers on their market. So these things are not that difficult. They're not rocket science. I think it's achievable.
Thank you, Adrian. Marco, we're looking at potentially if the decisions here or the advice here is followed through at the member state level, we're looking at potentially price of generics and biosimilars going up. What's your view on that, especially in countries in the east of Europe where co-payment is the highest among the region and would impact patients the most?
I'm of course worried. We are of course worried about raising up in prices, because that will be directly equal to stop the therapy, because patients will simply stop buying it or will simply stop participating in the expense for it and will not get it. It is a matter of fact. I mean, I have no doubt about that. It's not affordable. And, because one thing that very often we do not consider is that although we consider health a priority, very often we say, oh, health is the first thing. But if you have to choose between putting food on table and postponing a therapy, you will choose the food on the table that night for your kids maybe, but you won't get the therapy. It's happened. It has already happened during the COVID. We have seen it. And it's happening every day with the economic crisis that is getting worse and worse. But one point that I would like to make is that, we are talking every day, and it's good to do that, about the price of gas, the price of energy. But we're not talking enough about the price of the raising up of the price of therapies that are equally important, but there is the fact that they are the first one in being sacrificed. And this is a pity. This is something we need to avoid, because the long-term cost for the healthcare system in interrupting therapies now will end up in an enormous cost in the rising of hospital interventions and so on. We have seen this already happening in the past, and we need to avoid that, as we know what is going to be the consequences. I would like to finish stressing a point that has been already raised, but I would like to make it also from the patient perspective. And it is, if we are going through the road of supporting, so economically the situation, transparency is mandatory at any level and has to be the starting point. So I'm fine with supporting, but it has to be made very clear that we need to understand where the money will go and how the money will be used. I'm not personally a big fan of inflation reimbursement, let's call it like that. But on the other side, I see the necessity of a fast and direct intervention in a way that will not create troubles with state aids or whatever, but it's something needs to be done now, because it's already quite late. We have already the experience of patients interrupting therapies.
Thank you. Marco, Jakob, can you give us your position on whether or not member states should be providing state aid at all? We've got a question on Slido here asking, should national governments guarantee energy for pharmaceutical producers, for example? That's just one example of state aid for the sector. What's your thoughts on this kind of thing?
So again, I could maybe start it. First of all, the first or the last question, the state aid. Of course, for example, for the price of gas to meet the heating of the production and so on, that's again on the member states. We do that in the Czech Republic. So every pharmaceutical company who is producing in the country can get the guarantee the price of gas, and of course it's also based on the size of the company. It's very complicated, but we try to have this support for the companies. The other part of the discussion which was raised here was about the way how to support it. So once we increase the payment for the pharmaceuticals, for the generics, once we really involve the meet criteria, which will then definitely increase the prices, of course, the part of the cost will come to the patient. So in the Czech Republic, we, for example, have the ceiling for how much the patient can pay as a co-payment for the pharmaceuticals, for RX products in the pharmacies. Yeah. Again, it's on each and every state, to say, how to subsidize, this area. But as I said, once we increase the funds to pay for pharmaceuticals, if we may pay more, of course, there will be the bigger gap between the reimbursement and the maximum price. It's again a space which every company can use it. Not very often is they're using that, and it will somehow also transform, to how much patient copay if there is the gap between the price and the reimbursement. So I mean, we see how the inflation and all those things affecting every step we do, and we have only one money. It's not that we have like some extraordinary resources, and we just have to say, where we will send those resources. So, for example, I mean, we decided here to have this ceiling, how much patient can copay through the whole year, and at the end of the year, the payer funds then replace or refund the money the patients paid, above this ceiling. But it's again the decision of each and every state to say how they will support the patient, how they will support the industry, and to find the right balance. How much to send to the industry to be still, competitive, to be still able to produce it. At the same time, not to have a higher price for the patient. And as I said, I mean, we are using the only money we have, the money we collected from the people. It's the taxes, which give us the money, to cover all those things. So we are coming to very, very difficult situation. And again, I'm coming back what I mentioned at the beginning. I feel that the only good way is to have a number of suppliers, to have tenders, which allows you to have more companies, to be active in the market. Try to really have, the tendering criteria reflecting, the history of the company. If the company in the past had a lot of interruption or no interruption in supplies, how robust is the production chain and the supply chain to the country, and so on and so on. And then based on that, I believe, we will have enough companies to produce the generics with still affordable price for us. And also then we can also, introduce the more ceilings and more support for the patients to be able to not to pay much more than they copay, for example, now. But as I said, it's the only money we have. It's money from taxes of the people. So we are just recycle the money again and again.
Thank you, Jakub. Adrian, I'd like to bring you in and respond to a question that we've had on Slido. Are there any best practices that the EU can learn or apply from other regions of the world when it applies to, when it comes to addressing supply chain resilience? It's quite a big question to land on you at the end of our discussion, but I thought it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Just one point quickly on the co-payment issue that Marco raised. I 100% agree. It really depends on the country. Jakub is absolutely clear on that. But there are countries with very high co-payments like Romania or Greece, and our members are fully aware. And the measures we are proposing in those countries, we are trying our best to protect the patients from that so it doesn't fall out of their pocket with higher out-of-pocket expenses, just to highlight that we are aware of those countries and trying to work around that. The other point, indeed, there are some good examples. So, for example, in Canada, they have a system of this reference pricing like in Europe, except that what they do is the price goes up and down. So if there are a lot of competitors, the price will go down in their reference system. And if the number of competitors reduces because companies have withdrawn the products or for whatever reason, so there are fewer suppliers, as Jakub was pointing out, well, actually the prices go back up again. And that incentivizes more companies to come back in the market. So that's something called the ladder model, which comes from Canada, and it's fairly successful. Also in Australia, which is far away from Europe, but has a similar system to Europe when it comes to reference pricing. What they have done is to increase the supply to Australia, because Australia is kind of far away from everything, if you wish, and has some manufacturing, but not as much manufacturing, say, as Europe. So to make Australia more attractive, they've made a kind of contract with the generic industry to increase supply guarantees in exchange for better prices. So that's the so-called a supply guarantee contract. They haven't made it with an individual company. They've made it with the association, like the equivalent of Medicines for Europe in Australia. You could do that at country level in Europe. You couldn't do that European-wide. That would be more difficult. So those are some examples. Also, when it comes to manufacturing and resilient supply chains, I mean, the EU is looking at that. There are some models out there. So I think in India, they're trying to, for example, reintroduce certain chemical production that has stopped in India, that has moved entirely to China, just to have more diversity so that there's production in China, but also production in India. In the US, they're also, what Jakob mentioned, they have kind of support for production, which is basically like a contract manufacturing model. So they contract manufacture actually with our members to supply them with 5-year guaranteed supplies of medicines that are not commercially very attractive. So for example, if you think of some antibiotic molecules that are not used a lot, that are kind of reserve molecules for antibiotics, they make contracts for these for a long time. And then there's an incentive for the manufacturer to produce them, not huge batches, but let's say to produce them over time and to maintain that capability to produce that. And then they have those reserve products available for their hospitals in case of an AMR outbreak. This kind of thing would make sense for Europe as well, because it's not really sustainable to supply some of these antibiotic molecules that nobody uses, that are just there for a reserve. So this kind of thing would make a lot of sense. So there are good examples in different countries, and I think in the EU we can learn from those.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, I think it's been a fascinating discussion today, but it is time to wrap up. And I think it's something we're only going to hear more of in the coming weeks and months as the winter sets in and the subsequent pressures increase. Just to wrap up, I think what we've heard today is that companies are genuinely concerned about the supplies of their medicines with the pressures of inflation and energy costs soaring, as are patients. But there are some solutions out there. We've got member state level solutions around procurement and potentially, but we've got to make sure that if we listen to Jakob, we've got as many supplies as possible in the tendering process, so there are alternatives there, but also we could have some EU-wide solutions for longer-term resilience down the line. I think that's been an excellent discussion. Thank you so much for joining us all today. Before we go, let's look at the poll results. Let's just open this up. Here we go. The poll this afternoon was: when it comes to protecting patient access to affordable medicines, should off-patent medicine sector be prioritised in the EU and national emergency plans? And how could the EU and national policies be adjusted to deal with such high costs of inflation? So overwhelmingly, we've got yes, there should be a permanent adjustment mechanism in place with 43%. 28% said possibly, but measures should be implemented only in the case-by-case basis. 26% yes, there should be an urgent action for price adjustments to current inflation level. And just 2% said no, I don't think this poses any issues for access to medicines today. That brings us to a close this afternoon. I'd like to thank the speakers all for joining us. Thank you very much for joining us, all of you, and for the audience for your interest this afternoon. Thank you to Beatrice, our partner, for sponsoring this event and making it possible. Please send your feedback to live@politico.eu, and please also do check our website for any upcoming events we've got. We've actually got our healthcare summit in a couple of weeks. You can check that out. It starts on October the 27th, and we hope to see you there. Thank you and goodbye.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.